Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the next agenda is keynote session that will be led by Mr. Fazlur Rahman Hassan, SD MEPP, as moderator. For now on, we will hand over the flow of the ceremony to the moderator. To Mr. Fazlur Rahman Hassan, SC MEPP, the floor is yours now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, Mr. Governor, Governor Anies Baswedan, Governor Martin O'Malley, and Dean Robert C. Orr for the speech. I believe also the motivation for us in the workshop that we're bound to start today and for the continuing 15 days. It's an honor for me to be the moderator for the first session. We have for the next 3 days keynote speakers from the University of Maryland, and with different settings, starting from leadership, moving towards a resilient city, and finally, we will close it off with a smart city session. Through the workshop, we would be moving towards a more discussion, mentorship orientation until in the end of the workshop, we will end it with closing in early December. I would like to introduce the speaker, the keynote speaker of this morning session or evening in the US, Professor Christopher Mim. He's the Managing Director for Strategic Issues at the US Government Accountability Office. He leads the GAO work on government-wide governance, strategy, and transformation issues. Strategic issues addresses such topics as performance management and collaboration, human capital management, intergovernmental issues, federal budgeting, regulatory policy, and federal tax policy and administration. According to GAO estimates, during the 14 years, Professor Christopher Mim has managed the high-risk program, more than $520 billion in savings and other financial benefits for taxpayers that have been generated along with a host of management, legislative, and regulatory changes. He was also an elected member of the United Nations Independent Audit Advisory Committee, where he advised the United Nations General Assembly on the effectiveness of the internal audit and other oversight functions, and UN risk management, internal control, and other issues. He chaired the committee from 2013 to 2016 and is the vice chair in 2017. He's also a fellow and former board chair of the National Academy of Public Administration and adjunct lecturer in public administration at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. I would like to give the time and the session to Professor Christopher Mim. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. It's very kind of you. I want to begin in just saying what an incredible privilege it is to be able to be here with you and to work with you over these next couple of weeks on this vital set of issues that you're working on. I take to heart very much the governor's wonderful line of a crisis is expedited change. And I think that's a great framing for so much of what I'm going to be discussing this evening and what you're working on over the next couple of weeks. Before I get there, though, I begin my formal remarks. I must join all of my colleagues in acknowledging and remembering with you National Heroes Day. And I join you in mourning for the many who are lost and honoring them for their sacrifices on behalf of the Indonesian people. And I know this is a day of great mourning and remembrance for you all. The City of Jakarta and the Public Policy Center have put together, in my view, a very exciting and important program for you that touch on some of the most vital issues confronting us, each of us globally, as we think about what does government look like as we're dealing with an accelerating rate of change and an increasing complex issues that we confront. As the governor put it, that our role as leaders must be to both anticipate and react to this expedited change that we're seeing around the world. I'm delighted to be the kickoff keynote speaker for what I hope will be an enduring partnership, as both the governor and the dean mentioned, between the city of Jakarta, the Public Policy Center, and the University of Maryland. As was mentioned in the introduction, my day job, as it were, is working with the U.S. Government Accountability Office. That is part of our Congress, and it's basically the National Audit Office of the United States. In that regard, I've been honored throughout my career to have very good working relationships with my colleagues in Indonesia, in the BBK. And I can tell you that, on the international stage, their contributions to audit and evaluation of public programs, particularly in the area of environmental programs, is widely recognized and respected. I need to stress, though, that the views that I'm going to be providing tonight are obviously my own and not necessarily those of the U.S. government, and, as you'll be hearing in a few moments, because I'm going to be quite critical of some of the things we do here. So they're not those of the U.S. government. They're my own personal views. That I had the opportunity last Monday to meet with many of the 20 mentors that was mentioned that are going to be working with this program, and where we shared some thoughts and had a good discussion, I thought, on strategies for effective mentorship programs. And I need to tell you that I came away deeply impressed by the commitment and the engagement that the mentors have, and how much they're looking forward to working with everyone, all the participants in this program, to ensure that you have a successful engagement with the program, and that the projects that you work on lead to real public value for you. I look forward to the presentations in December, and I'm sure that they're going to be just wonderful in that regard. And so with that, let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to, I do have a set of slides which we have sent over ahead of time. So you'll be able to both see those, but also we'll have copies of those as we go through. I'm going to share the screen here. Whoops, I'm not seeing the screen that I may need to go in and, let me get this. Sorry, folks.
While Professor Chris is preparing the slides, I would also like to give a note that all of the session, the keynote session, would be needed from the participant to summarize a resume on this session. And we can move forward toward the essence of what we learned to all of the keynote to bring about on the issue and presentation that we would close in the end of the workshop. I guess the presentation is up and running, so I would go back to Professor Chris.
Thank you so much, and thank you for filling in there that very ably while I was pulling up my slides. I appreciate that. Tonight, I want to discuss with you some ideas and some examples of leadership fundamentals and strategic planning. And I'll give you the bottom line, as it were, up front and at the very beginning here, is that in many of the ways that we have thought about planning, that we've thought about strategy, that we've thought about leadership, that may have made people successful 15 or 20 years ago, or perhaps even the way we had been trained if we went to school that long ago in public management issues. Those are still valuable, but they're not fundamentally fit for purpose for the types of challenges that we face today. We're in a more complex environment, and so therefore we need to think in new and different ways about what leadership looks like, what strategic planning looks like, what performance measurement and engagement of our staff looks like. And with that, that's basically what I'm going to be discussing with us over the next couple hours. So the first point that I would lead us with is just on the change that we're seeing. It's been often characterized that we are in the midst of a global public management revolution. And the aspects here are three parts. It is global, that despite obvious national differences and differences in cultures and often government systems, levels of development, all countries seem to be facing a consistent set of challenges. Second, they're focused on public management, that these global challenges are forcing us all to think differently about how we deliver products and services. And third, it is a revolution, That is, as the governor was alluding to, business as usual. The old ways of doing business aren't going to be successful in what we're trying to achieve today. And so what are the core characteristics of this new public management revolution? I'd suggest that there's several, and I'll just walk us through those. First, there's a growing complexity in the problems and demands that governments confront that require a coherent and coordinated actions across ministries. We've already touched on some of those this evening, obviously the COVID-19 response, climate change, urban infrastructure, all of the issues that we fundamentally care about aren't going to be caused by any one program in a ministry operating in isolation from anyone else. That is, I shouldn't say cause. The solution to those problems isn't going to come from one program operating in isolation. Rather, it's going to come from very often very sophisticated networks of actors working across ministries, levels of governments, and even sectors. A second characteristics. Governments are employing a wide range of tools and approaches to address these challenges. That is, that it's not just a matter of government directly delivering services. That's still a key part, and that's very important. But increasingly, we see government working through third parties, whether it be for-profit or not-for-profit contractors, utilizing complex mechanisms such as public-private partnerships, having education campaigns, using the tax system in order to incentivize certain types of behavior to achieve public outcomes. The challenge that we have as leaders is to make sure that those various tools come together and are all pointing in the same direction towards the outcomes that we want to achieve. Third, we're seeing citizen demands are driving governments to be more transparent, customer focused, and to provide opportunities for civic engagement. And this is what Governor O'Malley was touching on when he was saying that the old approaches of government keeping information to itself and deciding when it wanted to provide information to the public is not going to be adequate and is not sufficient anymore. We're finding citizens and want information, and they are in a sense mashing that themselves. They're creating their own apps. They're creating their own stories and telling their own stories with government information, mixing that with private information or business information to give a very sophisticated picture of overall social performance. Fourth, the global financial crisis and additional spending that's been made in response to COVID-19 has really put a premium on government efficiency and cost cutting. There was never a time when waste or inefficiency was tolerable or appropriate, but especially now where we are in such constrained budgets, basically any inefficiently spent dollar is stealing money from a program that needs that money in order to better deliver products to citizens. The bottom line on this, and actually it is literally the bottom line on the slide there, is, as I said at the outset, the traditional ways of doing business will not suffice. Leaders need new and expanded skills and strategies to meet the challenges that we confront. We need to be operating differently. So the agenda today that I want to lay out for us is basically threefold. I want to elaborate with some examples on the current governance environment. I want to talk about some practices for results-oriented strategic planning. How is that different from what we've traditionally done or that you can get in the nice big thick textbooks on how to do strategic planning? And then talk about the role of leadership in the new abnormal. Being fully convinced that we'll never be back to normal. It's always going to be increasingly forms of abnormal that we're going to confront going forward. With that as the agenda, let me move first then to our first, the current governance environment. As we all know, in September of 2015, the nations across the globe, obviously including Indonesia, including the United States, and close to 200 other countries in the General Assembly adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development includes a set of 17 integrated goals, 3 of which that are going to be directly pertinent to the discussions that you're going to be having over the next several days. First, of course, is I'm going to be focusing a little bit on Goal 16, which deals with peace and justice and effective institutions, and particularly the effective institutions. You have discussions that you're going to have on Goal 9 on innovations in infrastructure, and of course on Goal 11 on sustainable cities and communities. I should tell you that I spend, as it was mentioned in the introduction, a great deal of time working with other national audit offices and at the UN on the 2030 agenda, and Indonesia's contribution to that agenda is recognized as, globally as a country that's taking the commitments that it made to both its citizens and to the international community very, very seriously on the 2030 agenda. So what exactly is the agenda, and why is it important for what we're going to be discussing today? First, it provides an integrated and individual set of goals and targets that were globally agreed upon. And that is that there was the understanding that any country couldn't just pick one and say, this is what we're going to focus on, and not focus on something else, because the synergies are really where they get their power. And indeed, the dependencies across the goals are absolutely vital. Second, it understood as part of Goal 16 that effective governance is at the heart of the sustainable development process. We cannot be successful on everything else that we want to achieve, on all the other 16 goals, if we're not successful in Goal 16. That is, in making sure that we have good institutions that fundamentally underpin that. Underpin what we're trying to do. That was a breakthrough insight with the 2030 agenda. As you recall, the Millennium Development Goals, equally important from the standpoint of progress, especially in reducing extreme poverty and deaths nationwide, equally important, didn't have, though, governance as part of the goals. They were viewed as enabling mechanisms or something still important, but not part of a central part of the agenda. And I would suggest that by putting a goal that understands that we cannot achieve anything else that we want to achieve in the absence of good and effective governance in institutions really shows that the power behind that idea. Third, the 2030 agenda, as we all know, has a common global commitment to no one left behind. And in fact, those that are furthest behind will be brought forward first. And so this is not an agenda for the global north, or for the wealthy, or for those that have been privileged, or for those that have contributed the most to climate change. And I'm, of course, talking about the United States here. But it's an agenda for those where we have to act, as well as on behalf of those that have been left furthest behind, and those that have been most advantaged need to act the most. And then finally, there is a global commitment to transparency, sharing lessons, and accountability through national reporting and rigorous follow-up and review. I mentioned a few moments ago about the global recognition of the role of Indonesia and its commitment. Indonesia is one of the very few countries that has already reported twice during formal proceedings at the United Nations. It's something called technically the High-Level Political Forum. It takes place every summer in New York. Very few countries have reported, not every country has reported even once. Indonesia has already reported twice on the progress it's making, the lessons learned, and the transparency on that. I've already mentioned a little bit of Goal 16, so I won't get into all of the details on that. But the basic principles behind it, as you can see from the slide, and their targets that are associated with this are effectiveness, transparency, access to information, exactly what the governor was talking about, accountability, and accountability to citizens, anti-corruption, inclusive decision-making, and non-discrimination in laws and policies. Those are the 7 core institutional principles of SDG 16 that were recognized by each of our countries, that if we're going to be successful in other things that we want to achieve, we need to make sure that we adhere to those global principles. So then, what does this all mean in terms of just the particular issues that we're looking at? It means first that everything is global, that we run into a set of, as you can see, Diane Stone, who's a scholar, has suggested there are 3 types of issues that we run into these days. Transboundary issues, that is, issues that cross our national boundaries, money laundering, pandemics, pollution, and drug trafficking. Common property problems, that is, challenges where it's not in the germane of any individual countries, such as the oceans or the Arctic, Antarctica, and then simultaneous problems. And this is the insight that you're bringing to this workshop and focusing on infrastructure, transportation, and sustainable cities, where nations are experiencing similar problems in areas such as education or health or welfare, urbanization, where they can learn from each other on good strategies to put in place. We have a set of interconnected challenges. We've already talked about these, of the climate, coronavirus, social justice and human rights, and in many places growing inequality, democratic backsliding and deconsolidation of established democracies under stress. We've seen that that's been going on for many years, accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis, and then problems in governance capacity. Let me now talk about, so the traditional way of managing programs, this is the most simplified logic model that you can see. You know, that many of them are far more sophisticated than this, but it's taken us to focus on the inputs that we're trying to achieve, which is the staff, the dollars, the budget that we have. And those are converted into outputs, which are products and services that are delivered. And then we make a judgment based on that as to what sort of results is that actually making? What's the impact that it's making on citizen well-being? And so we obviously know our citizens do not pay taxes in order to have, for example, an output of 100,000 people go through a job training program. They pay taxes so that 100,000 people that go through a job training program actually get jobs. Or they don't pay taxes so that 100,000 children go through a reading program. They want those kids to read better at the end of the day. That's the difference between the output and the impact. This is a tried and true way of thinking about managing programs. We use it, and I see this very often. What I want to suggest to us, though, tonight is that if that's all we're doing, we're actually limiting our vision, and that far more we need to be thinking more broadly about what would this look like in a results-oriented environment. Just for purposes of definition, according to the UN Development Group, a results-oriented environment or managing for results is a management strategy, as you can see, in which all actors on the ground contributing directly or indirectly to achieving a set of development results ensure that their processes, their products and services contribute to the achievement of those goals. That is, it's comprehensive, it's everyone working together, coordinating what they do, products and services and processes, towards a common outcome. And if indeed that is the case, then that logic model I showed you is good for each individual participant to use. But overall, what's equally important is that we have an understanding of how all of those programs come together. And this is the insight of what the SDGs are about and what we have called a results map. That is, it's in a sense takes the outcome that was at the end of the process and puts it in the center, and ask questions about what is the array of programs that contribute to a given outcome, what do they bring collectively to that outcome, and what do they bring individually, and how do they work together? Are they being effectively coordinated? Now, my dear friends, I recognize that at least thus far, a lot of this has been jargon. And so I want to apologize for that, but it's now time to start giving some very specific examples of what I mean, and I'll be using US examples primarily just because I think we have some major weaknesses in this regard. Very often these types of issues, these very complex issues, are referred to as wicked issues. Now in English, wicked can mean two things. It can mean evil, the famous movie The Wizard of Oz, right? The Wicked Witch of the West, and so it's something that's evil, but it also can mean something very complex. And I mean it here it can in both senses, but primarily in the complexity. So a wicked issue is a big, complex, boundary-spanning issue that often provides little time to react, and failure can have great consequences. And a hollow government, which is a reflection of wicked issues, is all the various tools that government is using in order to address those wicked issues. And so this gets back to that very first 2 points that I had under the global public management revolution. So let me give you 3 case studies of what I'm talking about here. First, we'll deal with food safety. Second, with the COVID-19, and third on climate change, disaster recovery and resilience. First, in terms of climate change. In terms of food safety. Food safety is a major, as you can see, a major public health issue globally and in the United States. In the US each year, according to the Centers for Disease Control, that's the CDC, we have 48 million people get sick from a foodborne illness. That's 1 in 6 Americans. We have 128,000 hospitalizations, and we have 3,000 deaths each year due to foodborne illness. I can tell you that when I discuss this with my colleagues here, my fellow citizens here in the United States, they find that very hard to believe. They think that, deaths from foodborne illnesses, that shouldn't be a US issue. That's something that doesn't happen elsewhere. That's not something that we confront. Well, they're incredibly wrong about that. It is a major public health concern for us. There was an example that the example I want to use is to show how we can get those deaths or why those deaths are caused is from a salmonella outbreak that we had in 2010 that led to a recall of 500 million eggs. Americans love eating eggs, and we're second only to Mexico in our per capita consumption of eggs. So I'm going to use that as an illustration to show the very complex arrangements of how we try and assure food safety, and then how that system doesn't work. And so we have a very complex governance structure for food safety. We have one agency, the Food and Drug Administration. We have a separate agency, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Food Safety Inspection Service. They have primary oversight, but overall we have 16 different agencies that are involved in food safety, and at least 30, and they're enforcing 30 different food-related laws. And what does that look like in practice? And I'm going to show you just dealing with an egg. So this is the regulatory approach for a single egg from a chicken. So the Food and Drug Administration is responsible for ensuring that eggs in their shells, which this is good, they don't use bureaucratic language, they call it shell eggs, including at the farms where they had the salmonella outbreak, are safe, wholesome, and properly labeled. Okay, so that's good. We have FDA make sure that the egg is safe, wholesome, and properly labeled. The minute you crack that egg to, for breakfast or whatever you want to eat it, the moment you crack that egg, responsibility shifts over to an entirely different federal agency. And that federal agency is the Food Safety Inspection Service, which is responsible for looking at the safety of processed egg products. The egg itself is FDA. A cracked egg becomes FSIS. A third agency, the Agriculture Marketing Service, sets the standards for eggs. Grade A eggs is what people want to eat, but does not test the eggs for salmonella. That, remember, goes back up to FDA. A fourth agency, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, manages the program that helps ensure that the hens that lay the eggs don't have salmonella, but doesn't look after the eggs. That's the FDA. And then, but FDA is still responsible for making sure that the feed that the hens eat is okay. So we got FDA looking at the feed, APHIS looking at the hen, FDA looking at the egg unless it is cracked, in which case then it's FSIS, but AMS making sure that it's properly, or doing the standards, but doesn't make sure that it's properly labeled. And at the end of the day, we wonder why we have food safety concerns. And we wonder why people die from the problems. Pathogens are very smart. They know how to navigate, here comes a joke, they know how to navigate the cracks in the regulatory system. Trust me, I would think that was funny anyway, but I realize it's not. But the point to this is that each individual program that I described is well run. I've met with the people that run them. They're good scientists, they're good inspectors, they're focused on their work, they have the good logic model for their own program. What they lack, though, is the system itself does not come together. There isn't a comprehensive view of how all of these various programs fit together. The strategic planning that they have in place is agency focused and stovepiped rather than comprehensive in a whole of government approach. And that's what we need if we're going to be successful in delivering products to our citizens, whether it be on a national level, whether it be on a regional level, whether it be on a local level. So we have what the egg story shows is that food safety is a whole of government issue. Our Congress tried to deal with part of it in January of 2011. They passed something called the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act. And as you can see, it did strengthen part of the food safety system. But the weakness in the act is betrayed in the title. And that is, it was about the FDA food safety modernization rather than trying to modernize the entire system. It only worked on one agency. President Obama tried to establish something called the Food Safety Working Group that brought together the secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services. These are secretaries are the heads of our ministries, to coordinate federal efforts to make sure this was, to put together a coordinated whole of government plan for food safety. Unfortunately, that meant that organization, or rather that working group, made very little progress. They met several times, declared victory when there really wasn't a victory, and then went dormant, and nothing has been done since. As a result, food safety remains a high-risk issue in which a government-wide strategy is sorely needed. Let me turn to a second issue, and that's COVID-19 in the United States and our just complete failure of a national response on that. We've had 9.6 million cases. It's now getting close to 10 million, over 235,000 deaths. As of earlier this week, we have our 7-day average was about 100,000 cases per day, and 1,000 deaths per day. And every projection that we're getting from Dr. Fauci and others is that things will get very, much worse. Obviously, we're going into winter here. And so as it gets mixed with seasonal flu, as people are coming inside more rather than staying outside, we're expecting even continuing spikes in the deaths that we have. Our Congress has acted and passed several pieces of legislation, the most important of which was on March 27th. It was called the CARES Act that injected close to $3 trillion in the U.S. Economy to universities, for public health, for support for individuals, to support for businesses. Our challenge is that we have not used a whole of government strategy to address COVID-19. Now, some of this is the failures of the current administration. Some of this is the larger problems that we had in effective coordination. And so we have had for a focus for a number of years on a U.S. biodefense efforts. And so what a biodefense strategy is it consists, as you can see, of all the efforts to counter threats, reduce risks, and prepare and respond to and recover from incidents. And these incidents can be human-made, they can be natural, they can be intentional or unintentional. And so it's a whole kind of approach to biodefense. Since at least 2009, so for many years, my colleagues in the Government Accountability Office have identified just the absence and the big challenges in the failure of a national coordinated strategy on biodefense, as you can see there. And so what did that mean is that in 2016, our Congress actually had to pass a law requiring for the very first time that we get a national biodefense strategy. Before that, we had nothing. It was all stovepiped, all individual agencies working in isolation from one another, talking, at conferences and when they needed to, but fundamentally no whole of government approach. The White House subsequently released that strategy in September 2018, as you can see, and then the implementing recommendation or implementing instructions is something that's what we call an NSPM, which is a National Security Presidential Memorandum. And so that was issued to help implement it. Again, this was the first time it was done, and it was done in 2018 in our nation's history. And so here's just a graphic of what that actually looks like. What a whole of government approach, at least is intended to look like for biodefense. Now, this wasn't used. This is broken down, and I'll get to, why and how in just a moment. But it was supposed to be an assistant to the president at the National Security Affairs. And so working directly in the White House, the various a steering committee chaired by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is the principal health official in our government, with other department heads, ministry heads there, including our Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Homeland Security, Agriculture, and then under that, a coordinating mechanism to actually do the heavy lifting, and then a focus on non-federal partners as well to make sure that they were involved in the decision-making that was taking place. So at the level of architecture, it was the right way to go. It was an attempt to bring together a whole of government approach. So when we look at this, we saw the key strengths of the strategy, where, as I said, to bring together the efforts of agencies with biodefense roles, responsibilities, and those resources to address the intentional, the accidental, and the naturally occurring threats that could take place. And then, as I also mentioned, NSPM established the structure and processes to assess those capabilities. It was basically the implementation mechanism or implementing mechanisms to take place. So when we looked across, we saw a set of primary implementation challenges that needed to be dealt with. And I mention these because these are very common to what we see when we look at all kind of whole of government approaches that have to take place. I mean, and so while this is particular to just this the biodefense strategy, this is not uncommon when we look across other whole of government approaches. First is that data collection was uneven. That is that, establishing and getting common data standards from the various agencies, even after they had acknowledged that they needed to work together, is an enormous challenge. And then getting that information in a timely way, in a way that can be used by decision makers, remains a big uneven effort in our government. We don't have a very clear picture across the entire federal enterprise of the risks associated with our biodefense. Second key weakness that we see consistently, but again most particularly here, that the processes, the roles, responsibilities for making joint decisions lack clarity and are not fully developed. So that that you can map out, as I did in the last you can map out in the last area and show on the last slide, show an overall architecture. But that still doesn't mean that at the end of the day, everyone's going to be sure how they're supposed to work on that and what they're exactly supposed to be doing, especially when trade-offs have to take place. It's one thing to understand and see what are the full array of resources that we're seeking to bear. It's another thing to begin to ask questions and say, we're going to make additional investments at one area perhaps at the expense of another. And that's a key point that we have to consider. The third is that the coordination team lacked capacity. There were huge capacity gaps in that. That there were capacity gaps, and that within the coordination team, they didn't necessarily have the skills that they needed the skills or the technical ability in order to gather the data that was needed, or once they gathered it, to do the analysis to identify improvement opportunities. And then finally, there was a vital need for a change management strategy. Anytime that you are making these whole of government approaches, we have found that that's often the underappreciated aspect of that. The importance of bringing people along, of discussing with them and making sure that they understand their role in the new, in kind of why you're making these changes and what direction you're moving in and why. That's absolutely vital. And again, it's underappreciated and very often not done nearly as much as it should. And let me just very quickly, Sarah, as an aside, if there's stuff that's showing up in the chats that are questions that you want me to answer, just let me know at this point. And also to Faisal, if there's things that I should be doing, just let me know. Other than that, I'll just keep rolling and we'll have questions at the end. All right.
We'll address if there's any comments in the end of your presentation.
Very good. Okay, thank you. I just didn't want to miss anything that anyone wanted to ask at this point.
Will do.
Okay, let me see, where was I here? There we go. So that's the primary implementation. That's COVID-19. Now let's move to climate change as the third example. This just shows some of the potential effects of climate change in the United States. And obviously climate change is a global phenomenon, and it'll affect all of us overall in a very negative way, through flooding, extreme weather events, heat. But this just shows the map that you can see of some of the economic costs, which especially we have another hurricane that's coming into our Gulf Coast down there in the Florida area. As you know, they've actually run out of the alphabet this year for the naming the hurricanes. We've gone through so many of them. We've had intense fires out in the south, in California. We had extreme weather events in the Plain States. We've had just an enormous set of challenges associated with climate change that everything tells us are only going to get worse. And so there's a focus obviously on mitigation, but there also needs to be a focus on resilience and adaptation. And so let me show you what, if you think back to that results map that I showed right at the very beginning, this is a rather sophisticated version of one dealing with disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And the reason I show this is not just because it deals with climate change, but I think it also illustrates the connection or the relationship between those individual logic models that I was discussing and the broader results map. And so if you just take that, take a look at the preparedness and mitigation branch and follow that out into pre-positioning emergency supplies. And one could do, if you were the manager, the leader that was responsible for the program of pre-positioning emergency supplies, you could have a very effective logic model on what you do. In fact, you should have one. What are the outputs, or what is it, the dollars and resources that you have? What are the outputs that you're going to do? And then how are you going to measure the effectiveness of your pre-positioning of emergency supplies? Likewise, if you move down the branch there, if you're responsible for preparedness and mitigation, and that is that you have broader responsibilities across all those other branches, how are you going to ensure that you're effective? You could do a logic model on that that's looking at individual programs and a results map that's focused just on preparedness and mitigation. And if you're responsible for overall and interested overall on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, you would do a results map that's focused on the entire process. The point that I want to make here is that, the logic models and the results maps need to work in tandem with one another. And what that means is, we're about to get to in just a moment, is that strategic planning and leadership needs to have an equally broad vision of what we're trying to achieve. It can't just be focused on one branch, or it can't just be focused on the end of any one branch. It needs to be focused on the collective that we're trying to achieve. And that's what gets into what I was just talking about a moment ago on the challenges of data collection, the challenges of sorting out processes and rules and responsibilities, the processes for making sure that you have the capacity in order to do the coordination, and the importance of a change management strategy. The World Health Organization, just to take one aspect of that, has done surveys with the national health ministries on the extent to which they have integrated climate change considerations into the national health plans. And this was a survey done by WHO in 2017 and 18. And as you can see, the major takeaways from there that they found. On the one hand, there is some good news, or quite a bit of good news, I should say. National planning on health and climate change is advancing, they found. But there's a need to strengthen the comprehensiveness of the strategies and plans, very similar to what I was showing you in the US biodefense challenges that we found. That the implementing action of key health and climate change priorities remains challenging for countries. There's challenges with prioritization. Again, that's similar to what I was just showing you dealing with the biodefense. There's barriers to accessing international climate finance for health adaptation. We need to make sure that, this is a bit of an aside, we need to make sure that as we're thinking about health, as we're thinking about adaptation, we're also strengthening the public health ministries. And then we need to have a multi-sector collaboration that in place. And so what the surveys actually showed is, you can see 51 out of 100 countries have national health and climate strategies and plans. So about half of the reporting countries said that they have those plans in place. It begins just to dip down because you have less reporting as the data gets more granular. 53% of the 45 countries, and so a little bit over, obviously half, reported moderate to high implementation of those strategies. So not all the countries that said they have those strategies and plans actually reported, and only half of them did, said they have a moderate to high implementation. And only 9 of 41 countries identified performance indicators that are monitoring the implementation of those. Another 13 of them did it partially. The big challenges, of course, are financing, leadership and governance, which is what we've been talking about, the quality of the sufficiency of the health workforce, and evidence, methodology, and tools. Again, all the challenges that we saw in food safety, all the challenges that we saw on biodefense.
Professor Mim, is it possible?
Yes, ma'am.
is it possible to take a few questions?
Oh, absolutely. At any point, please do.
Mohon maaf. Dari siapa ya tadi? So we'll have the question and answer session at the end of the presentation.
Oh, okay.
Okay, if that's good.
Yep.
So we have the complete picture of both of the complexity and then the practices, and then moving forward with the leadership. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, so we'll hold the questions to the end. That's fine. All right. So let's then so we've talked about the current governance environment, talked about the challenges and the need for whole of government strategies, talked about the gaps that we typically see in those whole of government strategies, using food safety, biodefense, and globally climate as examples on that. What then is the solution? How do we begin to work our way out of this? And so I want to talk about some practices for results-oriented strategic planning. Keep in mind the results-oriented, the definition that we had from UNDP earlier in the presentation, when it talked about all the various partners are making sure that their individual programs and processes and outputs are aligned towards a common set of outcomes. And that's going to require a set of challenges associated, or that's going to require a new way of thinking, I want to suggest. And so what does what are those core elements of how we lead innovation and change in this new environment? We need to, and this is what I'm going to be elaborating on as we talk about strategic planning. We're going to need to make sure that we focus performance broadly on the results that government seeks to achieve, rather than the operations of any single program or agency. That doesn't mean that individual agencies and programs don't have strategic plans. In fact, the beauty of strategic planning is it can be done at a unit level, it can be done at a geographic level, it can be done, in fact, many state of Maryland had its own strategic plan under Governor O'Malley. It can be done at an organizational level and in ministry or agency level. It can be done at a whole of government level. What I'm suggesting is that there needs to be alignment across those various efforts to be pointing towards common outcomes. This entails then for adopting a whole of government, or even at times a whole of society orientation, and looking at policy coherence, making sure the various tools and ways that government is achieving results are actually come together in a meaningful way. Second, we need to make sure that we foster innovation, including employing ICT to improve performance. And in fact, one of the things, perhaps in subsequent sessions, we can talk about the use of IT, and especially now, machine learning, in artificial intelligence, in order as just a fundamental disruptor of not just the private sector, but also government and how government delivers its services. But that's a much larger story for a different day. We need to make sure that we're thinking specifically about how we're going to use data and evidence to inform decisions. And that is making sure that our agencies have what's often called learning agendas. That is, that they've identified what are the key information that they need, and that they have very systematic processes in place to gather that information and then apply that to concrete decision makings. That's a model that Governor O'Malley talked about, and that he applied both at the state of Maryland and when he was in Baltimore. One of those tools was something called Performance Stat, which I'll get into in a few moments, but much more broadly, is just making sure that we have learning organizations that are thinking about what do we need to know, how are we going to get that information, how are we going to apply that. We need to make sure that we're managing systemic risk in addition to operational risk or the enterprise risk following any from one agency or program. And that is that, certainly all good organizations have an enterprise risk management, an ERM process in place that looks at the uncertainties of achieving their goals and how they're going to, what they're going to do in order to manage that uncertainty. You're never going to, or very, almost never will you be able to get to zero risk. In fact, anything important is going to entail, taking a risk. It's all about how much risk are you willing to take. What I want to suggest, though, is that in a results-oriented environment, we also need to be focusing on systemic risk. And so, which means that you're not just concerned with the risk of your own organization, but rather the risk of the whole enterprise. Because in many cases, the riskiest position, the most uncertain position for us in terms of achieving results, isn't going to be something that we're doing. It's going to be with one of our delivery partners. That does not mean that we own that risk. In fact, we don't. The delivery partner does, but it does mean that we should be asking ourselves and asking them, more importantly, what are they doing to manage their own risk? It means, as we've discussed already, and I'll get into a little bit more later on, we need to adopt collaborative mechanisms and network management across levels of government and sectors and with the public. And then public engagement is going to be a key part of that. We need to build government capacity in new and in different ways. We need to strengthen the center of government with new sets of skills in strategic leadership, data analytics, driving change. Very often the analogy is used to like being in a boat where the center is now seeking to steer rather than row. That is seeking to bring together and influence a variety of partners, some elsewhere in government, many in other sectors or the civil society organizations, to get them in a coordinated way. That's a different way of the central government to the center of government acting. And then seventh, I want to suggest that we need to employ strategies for civic engagement, open government, and transparency. As I said at the outset, is that we need to be willing to have a default where it is government information, it's the citizens' information. And so we should be putting it out there unless there is a very specific reason not to. For example, it's military sensitive information. All too often in the past with governments, certainly the case in the United States, the orientation has been completely different than that, is that we would only put the information out if it was asked or if we determined there was a need for them to know. Now the burden needs to be on government. It's the citizens at data. They need to be able to see this. They need to be able to understand how government programs are performing. So as we think about strategic planning, as we think about leadership in a results-oriented environment, please keep these 7 characteristics in mind. And they're not exhaustive. I mean, I don't want to imply that there's 7 and only 7. And, I'm not one of those people that like I'm not a management consultant that tells you, oh, there's 7 ways of doing something. You do these 7 and everything's great. That's for McKinsey to worry about. This is, so you need to apply these and think about what works for you and what doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, don't go down that road. You're obviously very serious public officials and experienced too. Think about what works for you. But these are at least what I've seen that have worked in the contexts where I've been involved. So then what is strategic planning concretely in this context that we want to have? And I want to give you 3 kind of very similar definitions to what I've seen here. One is from John Bryson, who's probably the most popular author and has done, he has a big, it's probably literally, it's about this big, a couple inches on strategic planning in public and not-for-profit organizations. And what he talks about is strategic planning, he says, is a deliberative, disciplined approach to producing fundamental decisions and actions that shape and guide what an organization is, what it does, and why. The important activities are strategic thinking. It's the strategic thinking, acting, and learning, and not the planning per se. There's a cliche, but it's absolutely true, is that the least important part of the strategic planning process is when you hit print, is when you get that document coming out. In fact, if it's a serious strategic planning process, the document will be dated almost from the point in which you hit printing. You hit print, because you're going to want something that's continuously updated. It's a living approach to, as John Bryson says, it's a living, deliberative, disciplined approach to producing, and this is the part that I find most persuasive, producing the fundamental decisions and actions that will shape and guide the organization. And so it's about the thinking that's in place. Admiral Thad Allen and a moment on why he's important, which is the second quote. Admiral Allen is a Coast Guard commander, was responsible for the cleanup of one of the largest oil spills that we ever had in Alaska a number of years ago, the Exxon Valdez. He was responsible for the evacuation of Manhattan on 9/11. And he was responsible for the recovery and response from Hurricane Katrina in 2005. In fact, I've often joked with Admiral Allen is that every time there's a disaster, there seems to be a call, and he needs to stop answering the phone if he ever wants to fully retire. But thank goodness for us, he hasn't. That is that he always answers the phone. Once again, he's going to say what strategic intent is, which is basically the deliberative discipline process that Bryson was talking about, is it focuses on an organization's visions, its goals, its objectives necessary to achieve the mission. Clarity of focus, desired end, flexibility of means. That's this is a quote several years old. What he's talking about is an agile approach here. You're clear on what you want to achieve, but you're agile on how you're going to get there. And that you with criteria used to chart progress, meaning you have data, that you're actually looking at how you're doing. And then he says, it represents a need to think ahead and plan backward from an envisioned future, making it clear how to take effective action in the present. Again, there's none of this definition has anything to do with actually producing a strategic plan. I mean, in the sense of hitting print or going around and waving a document in front of someone. It's all about the thinking that takes place is a continuous and ongoing basis. And finally, Dwight Eisenhower, obviously from the American US president and the Allied commander of Europe during World War II, says plans are nothing, planning is everything. The reason I give you these three examples is they're from very different time periods. Eisenhower, right after World War II, Bryson, probably 15 or 20 years ago, and although he's been updating his book, and then Thad Allen just within the last half dozen or so years, is to just underscore the three approaches using different words are all common in the sense that it's all about thinking, it's about fundamental decisions, and it's about a continuous process and not the production of a document, because it's bringing together a whole of they don't use it, but a whole of government approach is what we're looking at there. So then with that in mind, what does that look like as we think about what the contents of a strategic plan are? And so this is, this slide is probably very familiar to you, or at least the elements of this slide, because it has fairly common aspects of what a strategic plan is. And I'm going to walk through these, but we're going to talk about some of the differences in the context of results-oriented management. It has a mission statement, a good strategic plan. There's, excuse me, there's strategic goals and objectives. Their approaches are what is often called the strategies to achieve those goals. There's a discussion between the relationship of the long-term goals, the big strategic goals that we want to achieve, and objectives, and more annual targets, including cross-agency priority goals. Those are that contribute to a whole of government approach. There's a discussion of the key external factors, very often using enterprise risk management. In the US, we have two additional legal requirements, statutory requirements for our agencies, our ministries that they have to have in place. They have to talk about how program evaluations were used and a schedule for future evaluations. And then they also have to talk about how consultations were conducted and the results of those consultations. That is what Congress wanted to do, is to make sure that an agency wasn't putting together a strategic plan, making those fundamental decisions just within its own four walls, that it was reaching out to stakeholders, including our Congress, and asking them, what is the vision that they have for that organization? What's their vision of success? How would they measure success? What sort of priorities would they put in place? Now, the right to be heard does not mean it's the right to prevail. So ultimately, it's still up to the organization, the agency, to make those decisions. But the requirement is that they reach out and they actually talk to people about what's to get their perspective. So then, what's the going through each of those in turn? let's start off with the mission statement. And this is the one I'm going to spend the least amount of time on because it's the one that's probably changed in a sense the least from a traditional to a results-oriented environment. It, of course, explains why the organization exists and tells the outside world what it does. And very often a construction is used like a to by. In order to do this, to achieve this, we do this by doing that, let me give you two examples of what I'm talking about there. So for our Department of Education, that's our, it's a federal agency in the United States, says their mission is to promote student achievement and preparation, is their mission, by fostering educational excellence and ensuring equal access. Our Department of Transportation uses also a to by, but they kind of flip it. They start with the by and then get to the to. And so as well, so they want to serve the United States by ensuring a fast, safe, efficient, accessible, and consistent transportation system to meet our vital national interests and enhance the quality of life for the American people today and in the future. And so very often they use this to by construction. They're not intended to be bumper stickers, and the bumper stickers those are the stickers that sometimes you'll see people, maybe you have them on the back of your car, they'll have just a couple of words on there on something. That is, they're not just slogans, but they are intended to be short enough that employees and stakeholders can get a clear vision in your head of what you're talking about. You start with the organizational mandates, that is its legal requirements. And then in many organizations, we also see vision statements or statements of core values as well. Again, the mission statement is probably the one that changes the least as a result of focusing in a new environment. Where you begin to see some changes is in strategic goals and objectives, or a different approach, I should say. So strategic goals for a plan articulate how the government and its stakeholders will know if the mission is being achieved. And so if you go back to the Department of Transportation, which said that it wants to make sure that it has a fast, safe, efficient, accessible, and consistent transportation system, one would expect to see a set of strategic goals that, if not on each one of those, at least in total, would, at the end of the day, give you confidence that if we accomplish this, we're going to end up with a fast, safe, efficient, accessible, and consistent system. That the reason that this is so important is that, and I'm going to stick with transportation as an example on this, is that is that much of what even our Department of Transportation is trying to achieve isn't within its own control. So let me just take the safety one as an example on that. Like many other countries, and it is indeed one of the Sustainable Development Goals, we have problems in traffic fatalities in the United States, people dying in accidents or pedestrians being killed and cyclists being killed. I'm a bicycle rider. And so, I mean, that's particularly important to me, that we have safety for bicycle riders. So we have problems with obviously with as do other countries around the world with traffic fatalities. We have a relatively small agency within the Department of Transportation that's focused on that. It's called the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA. There are only a couple hundred employees, I think about 600 the last time I checked. They're obviously not going to control. They're not going to be able to determine on their own whether or not traffic fatalities go up or down. But what they can do is they can do the evaluations. They can do the learning. This is where a learning agenda is so important, to find out what are the factors that are most related to deaths and injuries on our highways. And what they have. And they found they are things like distracted driving, people texting while they're driving instead of having their eyes on the road. They found it's people in the US, unfortunately, there's problems with alcohol abuse, people getting drunk and then going out and driving and either killing themselves or more likely hitting someone else and killing them. They find there are problems with poor road conditions. They don't pave any of the roads. That's a state and local responsibility. They find problems that there's the need to improve the safety of our automobiles. Years ago, they didn't have airbags and we didn't have seatbelts. We didn't have seatbelt laws. The point to all this is that there are many factors that contribute to deaths and injuries on on the nation's highways that contribute to the Department of Transportation's mission of safe transportation, most of those are not in the control of the Department of Transportation. They're controlled by others. And so all they're going to do, and it's meaningful, is to try and influence that, is to do what they can using various public policy tools, whether it be education. You can't go anywhere in the US without signs saying don't drink or drive, whether it be legislation. In many states, it's against the law to be on your phone while you're driving, unless you're wearing the earpieces, and certainly you can't be texting while you're driving. That's against the law. It's against the law not to have your seatbelt on, but that's not a federal law. Those are state laws. And so the federal government has worked with our state governments in order to get them to pass these laws. It's all by working through these various third parties. And so that's why that stakeholder involvement is so important, because they're about, remember, the fundamental choices that the organization is going to be making. That's what the strategic goals are about. They explain the results that are to be expected from the organization's major functions, and how they're going to achieve those results. They are intended to be long-term and outcome-oriented. Not we're going to pass 10 laws, next year to reduce the distracted driving. No, it's going to be, we're going to reduce the deaths and injuries on our nation's highways. And to its credit, that's what the Department of Transportation focuses on, even though it doesn't control all of that. They said if our mission is to have safety, our mission, that means we have to have fewer people dying. We have to be willing to target that. And then we're going to talk about how we work with others in order to achieve that. Strategic goals are to cover all the major functions of the organization. And obviously, if it doesn't, it's probably an area that could be cut, if it's not part of a strategic goal. We generally do not see performance measures associated with strategic goals. However, they often, and I'll get to where we do see performance measures in just a moment, but they're to be stated in such a way to allow for a future assessment of whether or not the goal was met. So it's not just all, in a sense, that as we would say, a pie in the sky, or just this beautiful kind of, we want to end world hunger, we want everyone to be happy. I mean, I don't mean to, it would be great to end world hunger, so I don't mean that. But there has to be they have to be worded in such a way that at the end of the day, you could tell whether or not the agency was making progress on that. And then here's the key thing. So you have your strategic goals, and then underneath those, and I'll show you the chart in just a moment, you have strategic objectives. They break down those goals to a level that reflects the outcome or the impact the agency is trying to achieve, as well as the agency's specific contribution.